It is my great pleasure to welcome you back to the last of the Social Contract Research Network seminars for this semester. And it is my particular pleasure that in this seminar we're talking about a philosopher that I've long felt has been missing from this series. We've had seminars on Michel Foucault and the Social Contract, Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Alain Badiou has made an appearance, Carol Pateman, Charles Mills, and one philosopher conspicuous by his absence, one of the philosophers from whom I've learned the most over the years, is Paul Ricœur. And I'm very glad to say that in this session we are righting that wrong and thinking very directly about Ricœur and his relation to ideas around the social contract. And to guide us through this Ricœurian territory, we have one of the best possible speakers for this particular topic. Dr Laure Gillot-Assayag is a postdoctoral scholar at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. She's a former visiting scholar at Monash University at our Prato campus. And she's published research in the area of political philosophy in journals ranging from Ricœur Studies to the Journal of French and Francophone Philosophy, the Journal of the Philosophy of Education, Democratic Theory, and others. Her book on Paul Ricœur is forthcoming with Sunny Press, and in 2025 she received the Paul Ricœur Excellence Prize for the best paper on Ricœur. So would you please join with me in welcoming our speaker for this session, Laure Gillot-Assayag, and her title, Rethinking the Social Contract, a Ricœurian Perspective.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for this great introduction. I'm really glad to be here today, and I'm very pleased as well to have been invited to present my research on Ricœur at the Social Contract Network initiative led by Christopher Watkin from Monash University. So I'm planning to submit this article to a journal, and I would, for that reason, really appreciate any comments, feedback, or even harsh criticism on this presentation during the Q&A. So without further ado, I will share my screen and let's start this presentation. Can everyone see my PowerPoint slides? Yes. So this presentation is organized around a simple question. What is the contribution of Paul Ricœur to the social contract tradition? I will argue that his philosophy helps us to think afresh the foundations of political legitimacy by looking at the concepts of the political paradox, the institutional mediation, and relational justice, what I call relational justice. Paul Ricœur, as you've said also in the presentation, Professor Watkins, Paul Ricœur's political philosophy has received way less attention than other philosophers. And most of the work that has been done really focused on his ethics or his theory of interpretation, even though the recent work by scholars such as Christopher Watkin, but also Dan Stever, Bernard Dauenauer, has helped to shed light on the importance of his political thought. But before going any further, it might be necessary to take a step back. As we know, the social contract tradition occupies a central place in modern and contemporary political philosophy. From Thomas Hobbes to John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Rawls, the legitimacy of political authority has been grounded in the idea of consent. Classical contractualism generally rests on several assumptions. First, the existence of autonomous individuals prior to political association. Second, the fiction of a state of nature. Third, the idea that the political authority emerges from a pact or a contract. And fourth, the belief that legitimacy ultimately derives from rational consent. More recently, the social contract tradition has been challenged through critical rewritings, focused on including what has been people who have been formerly excluded from the social contract traditions. These critiques question the very premise of the contract by asking who was actually included in the agreement and who remained excluded from its principles of justice and political membership. Carol Batman in the sexual contract and Charles Miles in the racial contracts are notable examples of this trend, as they argue that modern political order were historically structured by implicit agreements among dominant groups, men and whites mostly, to preserve patriarchy and white supremacy. So this presentation takes stock of these recent critiques on the social contract tradition and examines how Paul Ricœur's philosophy can maybe provide us with resources, with relevant resources to rethink the social contract theories and maybe better answer as well these critiques. Paul Ricœur is indeed an integral part of the social contract tradition, but he reworks it from within. He does not reject belonging to this tradition, but he questions as well its foundations and its very purpose. He mostly shows, and we shall see that in a minute, that legitimacy cannot be grounded in procedural consent alone, whether this consent is actual or hypothetical, because for him, every procedural conception of justice presupposes ethical convictions, symbolic imaginaries, and historical mediations. And I would also argue in this presentation that he gives maybe a more central place, a more central role to the democratic principles of inclusion and pluralism, arguably principles that should be at the heart of any social contract theory, by moving beyond the abstract, individualistic, and procedural assumptions that typically define the classical formulations of the social contract. So to explain these different points, I will first examine the four main critiques that Ricœur addresses to social contract theories. Then I will explain how Ricœur's notion of the political paradox helped to understand the relationship between politics and society, and the role of vigilance that is absolutely crucial in his social contract, in his understanding of the social contract. I will then turn to the role of ethics and institutions, and that are absolutely essential for grasping the idea of relational legitimacy that I will put forward. And this final moment, I hope, will show how Paul Ricœur theory is maybe better equipped to respond to the critiques against classical social contract theories, including those I've mentioned, and propose maybe a renewed contract, a renewed social contract that better honors pluralism and inclusion. So Ricœur critically engages with the social contract tradition, and his critique is therefore internal. He's questioning the anthropological, the methodological, and the political presuppositions that underpin both classical and contemporary theories of the social contract. And so he departs from this tradition in several significant ways, I would say in four different ways. And I would argue that this critique, yes, can be structured around four main major points. So the first point I'd like to raise is the very idea of an ultimate political foundation. Classical social contract theories for Ricœur attempt to ground political legitimacy in an originary pact, whether it is historical or fictional. But the search for this pure point of origin becomes very problematic because it can lead to an infinite regress. Ricœur asks whether an unhistorical and an invented contract under a veil of ignorance, the one that holds to reformulate, or rather to quote Rawls, can genuinely bind a historical society. So he asks, how can we detach political legitimacy from historical experience, since political communities are realities that existed in time and are constituted through memory, institution, narratives, conflicts, traditions. Societies, for Ricœur, are not created ex nihilo by rational agreement between isolated individuals. So for that reason, he criticizes the ideal bias that he finds in social contract theory. And he is, to quote Ricœur, he says, the remaining gap between these principles of justice, still highly formal, and the legal practice evoked in the opening lines of my lecture requires us to question the mediation that principles of justice must find in a discussion that is no longer unreal, conducted behind a veil of ignorance, but in a real discussion taking place at the level of what Hannah Arendt calls the public space of appearance. So this is in The Just. So Ricœur really moves away from this idea of an ultimate foundation toward a more hermeneutic understanding of legitimacy. He is saying that the social contract should instead rest, I quote, on regulatory ideas that are aiming to guide social practice. The second criticism that he raises against social contract theory is maybe, and more or less explicit, this criticism, is maybe the neglect of imagination. He argues that social contract theories tend to overestimate procedural rationality, but underestimate the symbolic and the narrative dimensions of political life. For him, political communities also depend on myth, tradition, and collective memories. In his article, Myth as the Bearer of Possible Worlds, he argues that every society possesses a hidden, I quote, foundational mythopoetic nucleus. And this symbolic nucleus provides meaning and orientation for collective existence. Without it, institutions cannot generate political belonging or any social cohesion. Contract theory, on the contrary, often assume that legitimacy can emerge from rational agreement alone. And Ricœur rejects this assumption. So this is also one of the major breaks with classical contractualism, in my opinion. The third criticism of Ricœur regarding social contract theory, and in particular roles theory, is the problem of circularity. He explains that in Roles, A Theory of Justice, roles attempt to derive principles of justice through a neutral procedure, the original position that we mentioned before. And the aim of roles in doing that is to avoid grounding justice in controversial conceptions of the good life. And Ricœur questions whether this neutrality is actually possible. In his book, The Just, he argues that roles proceduralism already presupposes moral intuitions that it claims merely to derive from procedures. So he explains, I quote Ricœur, the procedural definition of justice does not constitute an independent theory, but rests on the pre-understanding that allows us to define and interpret the two principles of justice. So this is also the fourth criticism, this sort of presuppositions that are at play in Rawls' theory of justice. And Ricœur, on the contrary, he insists on reconnecting justice with ethics, but we'll see that later on. The fourth and last criticism I'd like to point is the idea that Ricœur does not believe in a Hobbesian anthropology. So this criticism is more anthropological. The last one was more on the methodological level and epistemological level. This one is more related to anthropology. And as we know, Hobbes constructs a political order on the basis of fear and self-preservation. In the state of nature, individuals are isolated, rational, fundamentally driven by insecurity. And Ricœur is very skeptical about this idea that a society could be founded on fear alone. How can non-moral motives can truly sustain political coexistence? So he says, first, the notions of abandonment of rights and relinquishment of power bear the mark of a virtually arbitrary voluntarism. No expectation coming from others justifies this relinquishment. So he is very skeptical about this idea that the other would bind a self-interested individual in some way through political legitimacy or through the political contract itself. For Ricœur, on the contrary, the self is never fully autonomous. Selfhood is constituted through mediation, recognition, and relations with other. That's what he explains in Oneself as Another. So in other words, the individual is not an isolated sovereign, but a relational being whose identity takes shape through interaction and interpretation. So legitimacy, for that reason, does not arise from rational self-interest, but depends on forms of reciprocity and recognition that are being constructed. So he criticizes hopes on two levels. Fear alone cannot generate political recognition. And second, the anthropology of isolated individuals is itself fictional. And that's a criticism he would explain in further length in his book on the course of recognition that was published in 2004, where he explained that a philosophy of recognition can take place and is actually shaped by asymmetrical reciprocity and states of peace, which are understood as fragile moments in which mutual recognition can happen, even despite the asymmetrical reciprocity in which individuals are to which individuals are confronted. So these four drawbacks of contract theory tend to obscure, for Ricœur, the fundamental ambivalence of the political. As I said, Ricœur does not reject the notion of the social contract, but really reinterprets it. And it sort of enables Ricœur to distance himself from two dominant currents in political thought. The first one would be a form of liberal optimism, which tend to view the state as a neutral guarantor of rights and justice. And the second would be a posture of pessimism or critical suspicion, which reduces political institutions to mere instruments of domination and control. So he rejects both positions, but he instead insists on the fact that political institutions must be understood as a way to guarantee conditions of justice, but are also weak at their core. And I will explain further what I mean by this expression in a couple of minutes. So the political paradox is what explains and encapsulates, in my opinion, Paul Ricœur's political philosophy and his stance on social contracts. The central question that is guiding Paul Ricœur's political reflection is the following: how can political authority be legitimate if the political power is structurally prone to domination? So we have to remember that at that time there was the collapse of Nazism, but also Stalinism remained a reality. And the question of the political at that time in the French intellectual milieu returned to the forefront. And most intellectuals ask themselves, should we believe in the state reason, or should we believe that state is about violence? Can it be both? And the persistence of this injustice, domination, and violence within the communist state required from this part of the liberal intellectuals to rethink the nature of the political. So for Paul Ricœur, the state retains some form of violence insofar as it is grounded in what he calls an originary violence, an initial violence, and it detains the monopoly of legitimate violence, institutionalizing this foundation of violence. So he writes, the rule of law thus stands in an interval between these two extremes, the initial so-called founding violence and that residual violence that everyone can perceive at work in police force, in whose favor citizens have been progressively deprived of the power of vengeance, in a sense that is expropriated from private relations of violence. Such is the first fragility of political power, its institutional and constitutional fragility, so to speak. So this is in responsabilité et fragilité. So the form of violence that Paul Ricœur describes stems from the intersection of two distinct logics. There is a vertical structure of domination and subordination, and a horizontal dimension of a community's shared desire to live together. And the tension between these two axes is frequent because the authority often masks and can even silence the more fundamental source of political power, that is the will to live together. So he says, when he explains further this idea of the political paradox, I quote, "A second source of fragility comes from the intertwining at the level of power between a vertical relation of domination and subordination and a horizontal relation constituted by the will to live together of a historical community. The intersection of these two axes constitute a second source of fragility insofar as authority arising from the hierarchical relation tends to conceal or even inhibit and repress the will to live together, which is the true source of power." And a last source of political fragility that constitutes this political paradox that he's talking about in his article published in Esprit in 1957, a last source of political fragility lies in the risk of corruption in representative democracy when elected representatives no longer represent their electorate, but their own interests. And he says, in the same article, I quote, "Clever politicians who turn factual power against the sovereignty of the electorate, the sovereign always tends to cheat sovereignty itself. That is the essential political evil." So he says that these paradoxes are almost tragic, and that's his word, tragic, since they pertain to the very structure of the political power, but nonetheless, they do not condemn us to despair or to being dominated by this political power. He argues, on the contrary, that political power requires citizens an active care and a responsibility, both from intellectuals and from the general public. Citizens have this task of sustaining the fragile fabric of the political community and fostering awareness of its underlying vulnerabilities, and ensure, more generally, that political life remains in this political paradox, in this tension between the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. So I quote him, "This specific fragility of power must be taken in charge, since we do not know of any political regime without a state, hence the paradox of the political." So this is in responsabilité and fragilité. So at the core of Paul Ricœur's philosophy, that was my point, is what he calls the political paradox. But to this political paradox that pertains to the structure of institutions, he adds later on in another article the idea of a paradox of authority. So an article published in 1995, so much later on. And he explains that the authority of power from above cannot do without the recognition from below. So you can see also the continuity between the two articles of these two axes, between the vertical and the horizontal axis. This time he says that the paradox of authority always involves a hidden relation of reciprocity. Authority exists insofar as it is recognized by citizen, but this citizen is always a reciprocity within asymmetry, since citizens are also those who are represented. And the paradox of authority does not cancel this vertical or horizontal structure of politics, but it also shifts the question of power towards the idea of multiple forms of recognition that interweave the two. And if I added some quotes. So a specific rationality, a specific evil, such is the double and paradoxical originality of the political. The task of political philosophy, in my view, is to make this originality explicit and to elucidate this paradox, for political evil can arise only from the specific rationality of the political. So, as I said, if political power is structurally ambiguous, it also implies for Ricœur that institutions must be subject to continuous vigilance. And I've tried to show in my previous work that the notion of vigilance is central to Ricœur's engagement with social contract theory, and that it might not have received enough scholarly attention. The legitimacy of institution for Ricœur does not depend on the perfection of their principles, but on their capacity to remain open to correction and transformation. And Ricœur thus develops what one might call a political ethics of fallibility. This perspective is helpful for making sense of democratic backsliding, but also institutional corruption, concerns that were also shared by a number of continental philosophers at that time, and even before, from Montesquieu to Raymond Aron and Hannah Arendt in the same period. In other words, political institutions are never fully just, but they are instead more or less just, depending on their responsiveness to injustice and their ability to adapt also to new social circumstances. Pierre Rosan-Vallon has shown in his book, Counter-Democracy, Politics in an Age of Distrust, that vigilance can be understood as a form of action rooted in, I quote, attention. So he traces its origin back to the French Revolution, and he defines vigilance as a specific modality of political intervention that does not operate through decision or the direct exercise of the political will, but rather through the idea of possibilities, moving in a field of possibilities and constraints. He is explaining this in the book I just mentioned. And for Ricœur, I would add that the genealogy of this concept can also be traced back to intellectual traditions with which he was rather close, notably personalist thinkers such as Emmanuel Mounier, and the phenomenological tradition, more generally speaking, because within phenomenology, this idea of vigilance was related to pre-reflective or pre-conscious dimensions of experience, the idea of joint attention. And this can be maybe some origins of this concept in Paul Ricœur's thought, but there is also, and that's maybe a bit daunting, a daunting interpretation, but maybe we could also think of the American vigilantes, because Paul Ricœur also taught at the University of Chicago in the 70s. And vigilantes belong to this long tradition of ordinary citizens taking justice into their own hand in response to what they see as a perceived institutional failure of the legal and political system. And so the archetypal figure of the vigilantes is often that of a white reactionary male, but one may hypothesize that Ricœur can rework this symbolic figure by detaching it from the logic of private justice and reinterpret it as a form of civic virtue toward the protection of the common good. So no more about the self-interest, but the idea that one needs to protect the common good. So whatever the intellectual genealogy of this notion is, the notion of vigilance clearly belongs to Ricœur's broader reflection on ethics and the constitutive fragility of the political. So he writes, I quote, "We ought simultaneously to improve the political institution in the direction of greater rationality and to exercise vigilance against the abuse of power inherent in state power." So in this sense, vigilance is more a state of alertness that involves variable degrees and attention to the fragility of the political paradox. As he writes, the city is fundamentally perishable. Its survival depends on us. So this is a broader call of responsibility, and he insists both for intellectuals and citizens alike. Now, it is also very important to know that Paul Ricœur's conception of the social contract is linked to his conception of well-being and his ethics in general, that is summarized by the formula of his small ethics: the good life with and for others in just institution. Unlike Arendt, for example, who tends to privilege exceptional action, the idea of action and foundation, Ricœur stresses the necessity of institutions and political structure that stabilize action. So he says the political is expected to ensure the duration and the solidity that action lacks in autour du politique. So institutions are mediations that distribute rights and resources, that arbitrate social conflicts, that organize political participation, and that make coexistence possible for Ricœur, and that might be the most important part. Institutions allow for the realization of ethics, but they are also structurally ambivalent. So there is also this idea of ambivalence of institution. They enable justice, but they can also produce injustice. They both protect and violate dignity. They both include and exclude. So justice is always, in Paul Ricœur, refers to this idea of being embedded in institutional structures that are themselves subject to ethical evaluation and political contestation. So justice plays a mediating role between the good and the legal. That's one of the title of his article. Unlike, for example, Hegel, Ricœur refuses to identify institutions with a superior ethical totality. So it's not the Sittlichkeit, understood as an absolute reconciliation and fusion between ethical life and the political order, because institutions never fully overcome the societal conflict and the fallibility of men. So there are mediations, and they function as arbiters between competing individuals' conception of the good. So if we understand, if we take into account the different elements we've been through during this presentation, we can identify maybe 3 or even more transformations of the social contract tradition that Paul Ricœur allows us to think. First, Paul Ricœur moves away from finding, as I said, this original moment of consent and justification, and he favors instead institutional structure of mediation. And this mediation also arises with the narrative constructions and exercising practical wisdom. He says that collective identities emerge through the stories society tells about themselves when they must make choices and are confronted with conflict of duties or moral dilemma. He says, I quote, in Quel ethos pour l'Europe, the identity of a group, a culture, a people, or a nation is not that of an immutable substance, but that of a narrated history. So this narrative conception of identity transforms the meaning of political legitimacy. Imagination, political imagination, is also a major, I think, reworking of the social contract tradition that Paul Ricœur brings. In his lectures on ideology and utopia, he explains that ideology tends to stabilize and preserve existing order, whereas on the other hand, utopia operates a critical projection towards the future and opens up radical alternatives. Yet, if utopia becomes detached from reality, it becomes an escapist and unrealistic move. Whereas if we only focus on ideology, ideology is preserving existing social orders and does not allow any sort of radical imagination or change, political change to take place. So he says we need to think of the tension between both. And imagination is also what mediates between these two poles for Ricœur. It draws from the stabilizing function of ideology. It acknowledges inherited traditions and institutions, but it also borrows from utopia its capacity to open up new possibilities and political change. So in this sense, for Ricœur, political imagination is a productive faculty that allows society to both remain rooted in their historical continuity and transform themselves in new ways. And political imagination, therefore, enables the inclusion and excluded voices and a possibility to invent new forms of coexistence. In this sense, Ricœur replaces the static logic of the contract by a more dynamic movement of mediation, interpretation, far from being established once and for all through an agreement. The social contract can be questioned, can be reinterpreted collectively in light of profound ethical and past experiences. For example, he also wrote on the non-violent movements. That could be a way to redefine, that could be one of the historical events that has redefined the social contract. And now I'm coming to my last part, which is that such an approach on the social contract has wide implications for inclusion and pluralism. First, his perspective, I believe, is important, is particularly important in dealing with the past of colonialism, which is a topic among many others he wrote about. In La Question coloniale, the colonial question, an article from 1947, he argues that colonial domination is a contract, I quote, vitiated at its origin by violence and deceit. In this sense, colonialism reveals the limits of a certain type of the social contract tradition and reveals the exclusion, coercion, domination, and asymmetrical pact that has been put in place. But he explains that this is not the end of social contract theory. It opens up, on the contrary, a space for forgiveness and reparation. And this is where his reflections on memory, history, and forgiveness really points at the idea of reparative justice. And the symbolic work that has to be done for addressing historical injustices and rebuilding relations that were damaged by this domination. And he uses notably the example of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa to argue that political reconciliation is necessary and absolutely essential to repair a broken societal link and to envision a new social contract. Drawing on Hannah Arendt, he explains that the, I quote, faculty of forgiving and that of promising are fundamentally political, end of the quote, because they depend on the plurality and the presence of others. So forgiveness is really what makes it possible to address past injustices, but promises is what allows individuals and groups to recommit, recontract themselves to a shared future. Regarding pluralism, Paul Ricœur also emphasizes the prevailing disagreement within democratic societies. Enduring differences in values, beliefs, and interests are part of any democratic society, and political institutions play the role of channeling and regulating these conflicts within a shared civic framework. So he says, I quote, on the one hand, democracy is not a political regime without conflict, but one in which conflicts give rise to discussion and debate, whose organization, their procedures and outcomes, is itself the object of collective agreement. And He continues a bit later, the idea of eliminating conflicts between classes, generations, sexes, cultural tastes, moral opinions, or religious convictions is illusory. In increasing complex societies, conflicts do not diminish in number or intensity, they multiply or deepen. What matters above all is that they can be publicly expressed and that rules exist for negotiating them. So this is in Langage politique et rhétorique, Political Language and Rhetorics from 1990. And he also emphasizes the fact that political ends themselves are plural and incommensurable, undecidable, and that there is no single conception that should claim definitive priority over others. So he says, I quote, there is an irreducible plurality of meanings, and the plurality of ends of good government is perhaps irreducible. In other words, the question of the end of good government may be undecidable. This is around the political. So there is a very strong conception of pluralism in Ricœur's, but this conception of pluralism is also mediated through the importance of institutions. And that's, I think, one of the originality of his political thought. His conception of pluralism finally appears particularly clearly in one of his articles that is named Which Ethos for Europe? ? Where Paul Ricœur outlines 3 ways of dealing with pluralism, honoring pluralism, but also resisting exclusionary political identities and the temptation to absorb diversity into a false unity. So he says, first, the model of translation should serve as a political paradigm for engaging with difference. Second, the exchange of memories between nations can counter forms of historical closure. And third, the idea of forgiveness that I mentioned before, forgiveness and reparation, offers a path forward and a response to the resentments that obstruct political coexistence. So he really puts forward this politics of mediation and this new basis, I believe, for social contract that honors the political paradox, but that also gives a greater place for pluralism and inclusion. One that departs from the notion of a rational consensus between individuals to think rather in terms of the fragility of institutions and beings and the ongoing work of mutually living together despite differences. So to conclude, I hope to have shown that Paul Ricœur offers a very distinctive and original contribution to political philosophy by rethinking the basis, the foundations, and the purposes of the social contract. His concept of the political paradox reveals the structural ambiguity of political power, which is simultaneously a condition of justice and a potential source of evil and domination. His account of institutions as mediations of justice also highlights how the idea of a relationality between individuals should be at the heart of political theory. Ultimately, Ricœur invites us to rethink political philosophy as an interpretive and a corrective effort to inhabit politically and ethically the political life in a responsible manner. Political theory, for Ricœur, in this sense, becomes less the art of resolving paradoxes than the practice of living with them and striving to make institutions more just in face of injustices. It is therefore, as I said, a way to accept the fragility and the continuous construction of just institutions to support relations of recognition and contestation, and therefore to guarantee a greater plurality and inclusion within the political community. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. It's always a joy to introduce a speaker and then to have that speaker fully deliver on all your hopes for the paper. And that is exactly what, let me just unshare your... here we go. There we are. And for the paper fully to deliver on one's hopes, and that's what I'm delighted to say has just happened. So thank you very much indeed for laying out that cornucopia of ideas from Ricœur so wonderfully for us. For those of us who are new to the seminar, the custom for asking questions or making comments is, if you'd like to say something, do please put a one-line summary of what you'd like to contribute in the chat, and then I can call on people in the order in which those comments appear in the chat, and I can make sure that nobody gets overlooked. And while people are considering what to put in the chat, I wonder if I could begin with a question of my own. And it relates to the question of the common good that you really laid out very helpfully for us in relation to Ricœur. And early on in the paper, you were saying, obviously very correctly, that he pushes back against Rawlsian proceduralism. And I'm just wondering what sort of common good Ricœur can end up with if he rejects Rawls. So from memory of reading the two books on the just, he brings in Michael Walzer and his idea of plural goods, and then I think he brings in Luc Boltanski and Laurent Thévenot and their idea of plural justifications of goods. And so you've got this sort of proliferation of goods. And then I guess my question is, once Ricœur has gone through all of that, does he not end up with something that looks a bit like a proceduralism, at least, with these multiple ways of justifying different goods? And if he doesn't, then how can he avoid what you very rightly flagged up as this sort of substantial, exclusionary, positive idea of the good that towards the end of the paper you also said he was resisting? So if it's not proceduralism and it's not a substantial idea of the good, then how does he position himself in relation to the common good?
Thank you for this first very challenging question.
Sorry. It was really on my mind.
It's actually very interesting. You noted that he borrows from different thinkers, whether it is Walzer or Boltanski. He is actually, I would argue, more interested in this pluralistic conception of justice than he is maybe by Rawls, though he commented Rawls as well a lot. So someone can push me, can push against me this argument. But the way he differentiates himself from Walzer, for example, first of all, is he is criticizing a lot this infinite idea of the social goods and common goods, because he thinks there is no common principle that could be found that where all the social worlds would be able to communicate together. So he says there is this patchwork of social goods that can stretch to the infinite. And so he thinks that the solution to this dilemma would be to look at one good that is englobing all the other goods, which is the political. And so he says we need to think of this pluralization of justice, but also to one principle that is organizing all these goods. He says the arbiter is the political. It's a very different kind of principle, and it's the structuring one. And regarding Boltanski, he's also very interested by their idea of compromise, because Boltanski and Thévenot were the first social scientists or political sociologists who really put forward this notion that I think interests more Ricœur because it keeps the idea that ethical conceptions of the good are different. People keep their own conviction, but at the same time, there is an agreement that is possible. And this agreement is not a rational consensus, as it can be in roles, but it's an agreement that is decent enough for people to agree upon it. But then, so I think he is doing this sort of a bricolage for his own political philosophy. And regarding the common good, there are also a lot of ambiguities that you rightly pointed out, because this idea of the common good, he does not seek to find a definition, and he also tries to avoid, as we said, the pitfalls of proceduralism. So I think for him, and that's what I've been trying to show in my research, but the idea of the common good is mostly the capacity to compromise between individuals, where people keep, and compromise has both this procedural aspect, where you have to find a compromise through a procedural procedure, but there is also this idea that we can avoid a substantial definition of the common good, where people keep their own conceptions of what good is. So I think that would be my answers. I'm not sure if Paul Ricœur would agree on this, but I think, yes, that's a way to look at the problem, by maybe shifting a little bit this the focus from what is from the conflict between the Rawlsian and Wadserian approach on justice.
It's an incredibly powerful idea, isn't it? The common good as the capacity to compromise. It just strikes me as incredibly fruitful, because it's not based on a sort of a positive capacity, is it? It's not a public rationality like Habermas, where it's all about what we can achieve. You know, look at how performant we are in public. That is the basis of the common good. It's actually the ability to withhold oneself and to withdraw to some extent, mutually, of course, not in a one-sided sort of way. So I think that's an incredibly provocative idea in all the best ways. So whether it's yours or his, thank you for sharing that. That's wonderful. I do have another question, but I would encourage other people as well to prevent me from monopolizing the question time. So if anyone does have a question, do please write it in the chat, and I will, in fervent Alma, wonderful. You've just stopped me before I wittered on for too long. So, Alma, if I could invite you to ask your question, please.
Okay, first, can you hear me?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you so very much. What a wonderful talk, actually, what a wonderful paper. Already learned a lot. So this question, my question is actually about rationality. So I put a blame on my ignorance first. But when you said about vigilance and exercising vigilance against the abuse of power, as you said, Ricœur believes is inherent in state power. You said this vigilance is going to improve political institutions in the direction of greater rationality. And when at least I think about rationality, what comes to mind is the kind of game theory definition of rationality, as the rational actors act in a way that we have Hobbes in mind. So it necessarily doesn't have a relation with the common good or the good of the other. But what is rational for me, or as an institution for power, is just rational. How does Ricœur actually define this rationality and greater rationality?
Thank you very much for this question. I think his conception of rationality, I'm not sure if he read game theory. My guess would be not so much. He mostly read the political sociologist working on justification. So I would tend to think that by rationality, he means mostly the idea of practical wisdom. So practical wisdom for him is the basis of rationality to some extent, and he defines practical wisdom. So he borrows this concept from Aristotle mostly, and he says that it consists in in inventing a conduct that will best satisfy that will best satisfy the rule, and that requires that we break the rule to the smallest extent possible to adapt to the current situation and the current circumstances. So rationality would be, I think, a way to inventing a conduct. And this is where we see that his conception also of agency and action is closely related to this idea of imagination. Imagination is not only creative faculty, it's a way to move in the world where you can improve existing conditions, and that can also guide your action towards more rationality if it's done correctly, which means if it's done in the limits of practical wisdom. But practical wisdom is also a very complicated concept that was also discussed by some specialists of Aristotle, saying that practical wisdom is there is this idea of the rule, and what is the rule? And Aristotle says, well, the rule is the man who is the phronesis, he is the rule himself when he has this practical wisdom in him. So there is also a sort of circularity of explanation that Paul Ricœur may be, that it's also maybe one of the limits of his idea of practical wisdom. But interestingly, he doesn't use always the idea of wisdom. He used the idea of practical reason. So sometimes there is some sort of a similarity that is drawn between the idea of wisdom and practical reason. And I think that's the idea of practical reason is really what he has in mind when he says the rationality of institutions.
Right, thank you.
Alma, would you like a follow-up to that?
Yeah, well, actually, yes, that explains a lot, and also, raises other questions, a chain of other questions, like what he means by rationality. If what he means by rationality is actually practical reason, it means that you can, through reason, one can convince and find one's way through argument, through reason, with the rational act of the other party. You act rationally, the other person acts rationally and maybe selfishly. So because they are acting actually rationally. This is my understanding of rationality. What works best for you? I have, again, this game theory understanding and meaning of rationality. And this is where actually such arguments as that of Ricœur comes to, is put into very stark contrast with economic and political discourses of our days.
Yeah.
Which is basically rooted in rational actors. So this looks to me like, yeah, we have this, we are not on the same page, I think, sometimes. I mean, philosophers are not usually in the same page with other thinkers in other fields, you know, like economics or even psychology. They define rational human beings, rational beings in a different way. And when we talk about this vigilance, yes, it makes sense. And when we talk about greater rationality, it makes sense, but it seems rational to me, and it's practical reason to me. Those who see the common good, and they see good in, you know, in its pluralistic form, not in its radical individualistic form. So how can we, you know, just try to reconciliate somehow between these two? This is actually the point where rationality, I think, becomes a little bit problematic, at least for me. I don't know if I could explain myself clearly or not, but yeah, thanks.
No, it's very interesting, because he also, in another article, he also criticized the way the economic domain is sort of extending over other domains, so extending intellectually, but also over the political realm. The fact that we are importing maybe some ways of thinking from economics is something that worried him to some extent. That's just a parenthesis, but he was really emphasizing the autonomy of politics compared to the economical domain. But it's true, when he speaks of rationality, there is always this teleological idea of the common good, of the good that he has, and that we may not have when we look at rationality from the perspective of game theory, that we do not have for sure. But I'm wondering, I see your question more as a, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a way to reconciliate maybe self-interest, the self-interested individuals, their rational calculations to increase and maximize their self-interest, and the idea of the common good that Ricœur may have, the collective vision, the pluralistic vision of institutions and of the political world we live in. And I think the ways he approaches this contradiction is a bit different, but he also tries, I think, he's not a fully optimistic individual in the nature of human beings. So he thinks there is this dual nature of human beings who are both capable and fallible, so they can fail, but they are also capable of doing better. And I think that his particular anthropology is a way to allow certain self-interest or the rational calculation of maximizing one's benefit, with the idea that individuals are also into this collective police, which is a very Aristotelian way of looking at the world, but and that they are, if they fail or if they maximize their self-interest to a way that is detrimental to the other individual, they can always correct themselves or they can improve. So there is this idea of improvement, perfectionism, that is also important, I think, in his thought. But it would be very interesting to see if he discussed, because he discussed with a lot of people, if he discussed with this game theory tradition and school of thought. And And I would not be surprised, because he also taught at Chicago, so he was very exposed to the American tradition as well of doing political philosophy and political science. So it's something I keep in mind for further research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if I could ask another question in relation to the idea of myth that you raised. So you very helpfully said that Ricœur supplements or perhaps challenges classical social contract theories with the ideas of myth and narrative and collective memory that they might tend to abstract away. But of course, myth also has another interpretation especially in 20th century thought, and it can be very divisive politically as well. National myths and so forth can be quite destructive. And so I'm wondering whether Ricœur gives us any guidelines or principles for distinguishing between, what we might think of as life-giving political imaginaries, sort of helpful myths in a sense that shape the social contract in ways that foster his idea of the good life with and for others in just institutions, from myths that might actively militate against that sort of life. Can he help us discern between different myths?
That's a very good question that I haven't thought of before. So so I would say the myth, there is always this the work that has been done on, for example, ancient and Greek mythology tends to show that the mythical level is also a way for humans to problematize and think about their own societal conflict and their own political problems. So the myth, at least in the Greek mythology, the figures of the myth are not so different from the humans. They usually have lots of drawbacks and all kind of quirks that the humans also have. So I would say that the myth that is honoring the ways in which Ricœur thinks of the ethical relation between humans are the ones that are fostering this idea of this positive idea of the social contract, which means that the relations, a relational being is something that is central in his thought. The fact that the individual is not isolated from others, but acquires indirect understanding through the narration and through others. So that's why also he rejects, to some extent, Hobbesian anthropology, because he thinks that autonomous individuals in the state of nature is not something that is going to be conducive to a political collective contract afterwards. So I would say the myths that sort of reflect this ethical, this relationality between humans, and that also questions maybe political evil, are the ones that should be fostered. And the idea of paradox is also echoing myths, because a myth is not offering necessarily a very clear-cut answer to a political issue. So the ambiguity, the fact that there is a tension in the myth, a tension that allows interpretation, is something that could be valued. The fact that a myth is not a piece of propaganda, that could be the difference to make. but that there is some sort of ambiguity that opens up new interpretations and different ways of interpreting the same event is something that could help us, I think, to differentiate between, so to speak, good and bad myth for the social contract. But he is very concerned about the exclusionary discourse of politics, the ways in which identities are pitted against each other. So at the same time, we should honor pluralism. We should honor different conceptions of the good. But at the same time, we should envision some sort of collective that allows us to live together. So I think this idea of tension, productive tension, is very important in understanding the relevance of myth as well.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I'm sort of poised to ask a follow-up, but I will preface it by saying that if anyone else has a question, first of all, I'd much rather listen to yours than ask another of mine. And also, we are gradually coming towards the end now, so this may be your last chance to ask a question. So with those encouragements ringing in people's ears, let me ask my little follow-up. So he is for this idea of a pluralism where there are multiple ideas of the good that circulate in society, and that's great. But can he account for any limit to that plurality? So in your last answer, you were saying that, you know, they have to be sort of conducive to the common good. So I guess what would it take for a particular view of the good to be discounted by Ricœur, or for him to say, not that one, not that idea of the good? What's the limit for him of the plurality of visions of the good that can be allowed into this sort of pluralistic vision?
So I think the limit of plurality would be probably the idea of non-recognition, in the sense that in his work, the course of recognition, there is a journey of recognition. And even though this recognition is not always bound to happen, and it can lead to, he says, a bad infinite, where demands of recognition keep proliferating and there is no way to recognize everyone, each and everyone. But he also says that this course of recognition is what basically defines the social contract and what is the fabric of political life. So if there is a claim that would argue that we should not recognize other people's, or we should not accept this course of recognition, rather, I think he would discard it. He doesn't speak so much of dignity, but at the very core of his ethics is also the Christian ethics. So there is this very strong background of dignity, non-humiliation, that probably would be other elements to take into account. And a refusal of the person as a person, this is his more Kant side, I think is also, would be also his take. So to some extent, it can be quite a demanding political philosophy for our times. And I think he probably realizes it, but his ways of moderating it is also to say that humans are somehow fallible. They can fail, but they can also improve. So I think that would be the limits. At the same time, he's always been in dialogue with people from different convictions, different political groups, not really the extreme political parties. But so I don't think he would be in favor, for example, of militant democracy, favor of banning political parties. but he would probably a Ricœurian conception on that aspect would be more to point at the limits, the inner contradictions of their speech, maybe to think in terms of education, to the course of recognition, to the ethical core that we should honor in every individual. But I don't think he would necessarily be in favor of banning, for example, parties from the discussion, because there is this idea again of inclusion, and this idea that a democracy, there are conflicts and disagreements that are that cannot be escaped, that cannot be avoided. So there is also this ambivalence. There are very strong ideas about recognition and human beings, and at the same time, he's conscious that the discussion and the debate must go on. Otherwise, there is a risk of radicalization even more of these groups. So, yeah, but that's my interpretation of Paul Ricœur. Yes.
Yes, no, I think you're absolutely right. He does not strike one as someone who would be especially keen on banning people or parties. This does draw us to the end of our time together for this session. It has been a particularly rich and I think also challenging foray into aspects of the social contracts and the common good. And we have you greatly to thank for leading us on that journey. So if you would please join with me in thanking our speaker for this session, Dr. Laure Gillot-Assayag. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much for the great questions. It really opened up different fields and paths of inquiry for the next month. So thank you very much.
Always happy to sort of contribute to the next article.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna, for your